the day my mother whispered, "I gave birth to him," outside a courtroom. I realized I had destroyed the only people who ever truly loved me. And the worst part? I did it for the woman who was about to ruin my entire life. I'm 36 years old now, and if you're listening to this, it probably means I've finally found the courage to say something out loud that I spent years trying to bury inside my chest. Because the truth is, my life didn't fall apart in a single moment the way people imagine when they see headlines or courtroom footage. It began quietly, almost invisibly, on the day I met my wife, Olivia, a woman I loved with a kind of blind devotion that I now realize was less about love and more about fear of losing her, and that fear slowly pushed me to do something unforgivable. I began erasing the people who had loved me the longest, my own parents. When Olivia and I first met in Denver, she felt like sunlight after a long winter, confident, magnetic, the type of woman who walked into a room and somehow made every conversation orbit around her, and I remember thinking I had never met anyone so ambitious, someone who talked about success like it was air she needed to breathe, someone who looked at the future like it was already hers to claim, and in the beginning she even admired how close I was with my family. She used to smile when my mother called and joke about how rare it was to see a grown man who still had Sunday dinners with his parents. But that admiration changed slowly after she moved into my small suburban house just outside the city, because suddenly the same family she once said she admired became something she described as suffocating, and at first the complaints were so small I barely noticed them. She'd sigh when my mom called during dinner and say maybe we should have more boundaries, or she'd laugh awkwardly after my father offered advice about fixing something around the house and say he treated me like a kid who couldn't handle his own life, and I didn't think much about it then. I thought it was just the adjustment that comes with marriage, the kind of friction people always talk about when two lives merge together, but those small complaints slowly turned into something heavier, something sharper, until Olivia started telling me my parents were interfering in our relationship, that they were judging her, that every Sunday dinner at their house made her feel like she was being evaluated by people who would never truly accept her, and because I loved her so deeply and wanted to protect the life we were building together, I started doing things I never imagined I would do. I began ignoring my mother's calls more often, telling myself I'd call her back later, even though later rarely came. I canceled family visits with excuses about work, and one evening when my father offered an opinion about how Olivia and I were handling something, I actually told him he needed to respect our boundaries, words that felt strange even as they left my mouth because my parents had never once tried to control my life. They had always simply been there, quietly supportive, quietly proud, but Olivia would cry whenever I questioned her interpretation of their behavior. She would sit on the edge of the bed with tears in her eyes and say she felt like an outsider in my family, that they didn't want her around, that they were slowly turning me against her. And each time she said those things I felt this rising panic that maybe she was right, and I just couldn't see it because I had grown up inside that family dynamic. And the more she cried, the more determined I became to prove that my loyalty belonged to my wife, not my parents, and that determination slowly turned me into someone I barely recognized, someone who started drawing harsh lines between the two worlds of his life, until the night everything truly changed. The night my parents drove nearly 2 hours to my house because they hadn't heard from me in weeks and were worried something had happened, and when they arrived unannounced, Olivia suddenly locked herself in the bedroom claiming she was having a panic attack, whispering through the door that my parents hated her, that their visit was proof they didn't respect our marriage, that they were trying to force themselves back into my life so they could control me again. And I remember standing there in the hallway feeling like I was being pulled between two completely different realities, one where my parents were simply worried about their son, and another where they were villains trying to sabotage my marriage. And in that moment I made the worst decision of my life because I chose the second reality, the one Olivia had carefully planted in my mind for months, and I walked into the living room where my parents were sitting awkwardly on the couch looking exhausted from the long drive, and I started yelling at them, louder than I had ever spoken to them in my entire life, accusing them of interfering in my marriage, telling them they needed to stop showing up uninvited and start respecting the boundaries I had set. And I can still see the confusion in my father's eyes as he tried to calm me down, telling me they only came because they were worried about me, but by then I was too deep in the lie I had convinced myself was truth. And when my mother's voice cracked and she looked at me with tears forming in her eyes and asked the question that still haunts me every night, "Son, what did we do?" I didn't answer her, not because I had a reason but because there was no reason, There was only pride and fear, and the desperate need to prove my loyalty to the woman waiting behind the bedroom door. So instead of answering, I simply walked to the front door, opened it, and told them they needed to leave. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced because my parents didn't argue, they didn't shout back. They just slowly stood up, my father placing a gentle hand on my mother's shoulder as they walked toward the door like two people who suddenly realized the son they raised wasn't standing in front of them anymore. And when they stepped outside, my mother turned back for a second, as if she wanted to say something else, something important, but I closed the door before she could speak. And as the lock clicked into place behind them, I heard Olivia's bedroom door open softly, and when I turned around she was standing there watching me with a small, satisfied smile that I didn't question at the time, because I thought I had just protected my marriage. I thought I had proven my loyalty to the woman I loved. But the truth I didn't understand until years later, was that in that single moment, standing in my quiet suburban house with my parents driving away into the dark, I had unknowingly handed my entire life to the wrong person. Looking back now, the part that still sends a cold weight through my chest isn't just how quickly my parents disappeared from my life, it's how quietly Olivia replaced them with her own version of reality. How effortlessly she became the only voice I listened to, the only person whose opinion mattered, and how I allowed that to happen without questioning a single step along the way. Because once my family was gone, there was no one left to challenge the story she was slowly building around me. She started saying things that sounded reasonable at first, things that made me feel like a good husband for agreeing with her, like when she told me that marriage meant putting your partner above everyone else, that real loyalty meant protecting your spouse even when it was uncomfortable, and I believed her because I thought that was what commitment looked like. So when she suggested I should step away from my stable engineering job to help grow her marketing startup, she framed it like we were building a shared future together, like this was our chance to create something bigger than the predictable life I had been living. And I remember sitting at our kitchen table one evening while she showed me spreadsheets and business plans, explaining how with my technical background and her marketing skills we could turn her small company into something massive within a few years, something that would secure our financial freedom. And when I hesitated because leaving my job felt risky, she looked at me with that mixture of disappointment and vulnerability she had mastered so well, and asked me if I truly believed in her dreams, and that question alone was enough to silence every doubt I had, because loving her had slowly turned into proving myself to her. So I resigned from the job I had spent nearly a decade building, and threw myself completely into helping her company grow, telling myself that sacrifices like this were what strong marriages required. But as the months passed, something subtle started shifting in the way she handled our finances, small changes that seemed harmless on the surface, like suggesting we merge our bank accounts because married couples shouldn't keep financial walls between them, or recommending that we move my savings into the business to help with expansion because investing in our own company made more sense than letting money sit in a bank earning nothing. And each time she brought up these decisions she spoke with such confidence that questioning her felt almost disloyal. So I agreed again and again, signing documents she placed in front of me, trusting the way she smiled and reassured me that everything we were doing was for us, for the future we were building together. Meanwhile, my parents slowly faded further into silence, their calls becoming less frequent after weeks of being ignored, their text messages shorter each time they tried to reach me, until eventually even those stopped coming, and I convinced myself that distance was simply the natural result of adulthood, that families sometimes drift apart when people get married and start their own lives, even though deep down there was a quiet voice inside me asking why I had allowed that drift to happen so completely, why I had never once tried to repair the bridge I had burned. But Olivia always had an answer ready whenever guilt crept into my mind, reminding me that my parents had tried to control me, that reconnecting with them would only reopen old conflicts and poison the peace we had created together, and hearing those words enough times eventually made them feel like truth. The business grew quickly during those years, at least from the outside, because Olivia was brilliant at presenting success. She knew how to talk to investors, how to network with clients, how to make everything appear larger and more profitable than it actually was, and I admired her for that ability, even when the long hours and constant financial pressure started wearing me down. But I kept telling myself that this was the price of ambition, that one day we would look back on these struggles as the foundation of something incredible, until the night that would quietly seal my fate without me realizing it. It was late, almost midnight, when Olivia walked into the house looking pale and shaken in a way I had never seen before, her hands trembling as she dropped her purse on the counter, and told me something had gone wrong with the company's tax filings. That her accountant had made a serious mistake that might attract government attention if it wasn't corrected immediately, and the fear in her voice felt so real that I didn't even think to question the story she was telling me. I just listened as she explained that the accountant had recommended temporarily transferring certain financial responsibilities to my name while the paperwork was being corrected, because doing so would supposedly make the company's records look cleaner if anyone reviewed them during the adjustment period. And when I asked if that was safe, she stepped closer and placed her hands on my shoulders the way she always did when she wanted me to trust her completely, telling me that this was only a temporary technical fix, something that would disappear once the accountant finished updating the records, and she reminded me that the company belonged to both of us now, that protecting the business meant protecting our future together, and hearing that word, our, was enough to dissolve the last bit of hesitation I had left. Because by that point I had already sacrificed my career, my financial independence, and my relationship with my parents for this marriage, so signing one more document felt insignificant compared to everything else I had already given up. She placed the paperwork in front of me on the dining table, the pages filled with dense legal language I barely glanced at before picking up the pen, and I remember she watched me carefully as I signed my name across the lines, her expression unreadable for a moment before she finally exhaled in relief and wrapped her arms around me, thanking me for trusting her the way a husband should trust his wife. And I kissed her forehead and told her everything would be okay, that we would get through this together just like we had gotten through everything else, completely unaware that the document I had just signed wasn't a temporary solution at all, but a permanent transfer of responsibility. 4 financial decisions I had never even been part of. A piece of paper that would later sit on a courtroom table as prosecutors pointed to my signature and described me as the mastermind behind crimes I didn't even know existed. And the most painful part of remembering that night now isn't just the betrayal that came later. It's the realization that when I placed that pen down and promised Olivia everything would be fine, I genuinely believed I was protecting the person I loved, never understanding that in that quiet moment, inside the house where my parents' voices had once filled every Sunday evening with laughter, I had unknowingly signed away the last piece of the life I used to have. The morning the police knocked on my door started like any other ordinary day, the kind of quiet suburban morning where the world feels slow and harmless, and I remember waking up half asleep, confused by the pounding on the front door, thinking maybe a neighbor needed help or a delivery driver had the wrong house. But the moment I opened it and saw 2 officers standing there with serious expressions, everything inside my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. At first I honestly thought it was some kind of mistake, some strange misunderstanding that would clear itself up in a few minutes, because the life I believed I was living didn't include police warrants or accusations. But when one of the detectives asked my name and then held up a document with my full name printed across the top in bold letters, the confusion turned into something heavier, something colder, and I remember actually laughing under my breath for a second because it felt unreal, like watching someone else's nightmare unfold in front of me, until the detective calmly explained that I was being investigated for financial fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement connected to Olivia's company. Those words sounded so absurd that my brain refused to process them at first, because the company wasn't even mine in the way they were describing. I had simply helped Olivia grow it, signed paperwork when she asked, trusted her explanations about financial matters I didn't fully understand, and I kept trying to tell the officers that there must be some mistake, that they should speak with my wife because she handled the business finances. But that was the moment the detective said something that felt like the ground suddenly disappearing beneath my feet. He told me Olivia had already spoken to investigators, that she had provided a full statement explaining how I secretly controlled the company finances, how I manipulated her into signing documents she didn't understand, how she had lived in fear of confronting me about it, and hearing those words felt like someone had punched the air out of my lungs, because the woman he was describing sounded like a victim, and the man she was accusing sounded like a stranger I didn't recognize. Yet somehow that stranger was me. I turned toward the hallway expecting Olivia to appear and explain the misunderstanding, expecting her to laugh nervously and tell the officers there had been some confusion. But instead she stood there quietly in the doorway, wearing a loose sweater, her eyes red as if she had been crying, and when the officers looked at her she lowered her gaze and whispered that she had tried to stay silent for years because she was afraid of what I might do if the truth came out. And that was the moment something inside my mind completely shattered. Because the same woman who had begged me to sign documents for the sake of our future was now standing a few feet away pretending she had been terrified of me all along. Everything that happened after that moved at a speed that felt impossible to control. Officers stepping into the house, reading legal statements, neighbors quietly watching through their windows as I was escorted outside like a criminal. And I remember noticing the curtains across the street shifting as people tried to get a better look at the man being led away in handcuffs. The same neighbors who had waved to me every morning now staring like they were witnessing something shameful unfolding in real time. By the time I reached the police station, the damage had already begun spreading far beyond that street, because someone had tipped off local reporters and my name started appearing on news websites within hours, headlines describing a suburban financial fraud scheme, using my photograph from a company website as if it were proof of guilt. And while I sat in an interrogation room trying to explain the truth to investigators who seemed convinced they already understood the story, my phone was exploding with messages from former coworkers, acquaintances, and even distant relatives asking if the accusations were real. The humiliation was immediate and overwhelming, but the deeper pain came when Olivia officially filed a statement through her lawyer later that afternoon describing me as controlling, abusive, and financially manipulative, claiming I had forced her to transfer business responsibilities to my name so I could hide illegal activity behind her company. And reading those accusations felt like watching someone carefully rewrite my entire life into a story where I was the villain. She even moved out of the house that same day, telling authorities she needed protection from me while the investigation continued, and suddenly the home I had once defended so fiercely against my own parents became evidence in a case portraying me as a predator hiding behind suburban normalcy. The most terrifying realization came slowly as investigators began laying documents on the table in front of me: contracts, tax records, financial authorizations, every single page stamped with my signature, each piece of paper forming a puzzle that painted me as the central figure behind a complicated financial scheme. And I felt my stomach sink deeper with every document because I remembered signing them all, remembered trusting Olivia's explanations, remembered believing that protecting our marriage meant trusting her decisions without question. And now those same signatures were being used as proof that I had orchestrated everything. It was like watching a trap reveal itself piece by piece, realizing that the narrative investigators believed had been carefully constructed long before the police ever knocked on my door. And the worst part wasn't just the accusations or the media humiliation or the strangers online calling me a criminal before any trial had even begun. It was the horrifying clarity of understanding that Olivia had built this entire story while I was still defending her, while I was still cutting ties with my parents and sacrificing my career to prove my loyalty. And now that story had become the official version of events everyone believed. By the end of the day, my bank accounts were frozen, my access to company records revoked, and my name was circulating across social media like a scandal people were eager to judge. And as I sat alone inside a holding cell later that night staring at the cold concrete wall, replaying every decision I had made over the past few years, one brutal truth finally settled inside my mind with a weight I couldn't escape. The woman I had chosen over my entire family, the woman I had trusted more than anyone else in my life, had just sacrificed me completely to save herself. Months passed before my case finally reached court, and by that time I had already lost almost everything that once defined my life. My job was gone, my professional reputation was shattered, my house had become a place filled with silence and whispers from neighbors who used to greet me with smiles but now crossed the street just to avoid being seen near the man the news had already labeled a financial predator. And the humiliation didn't just live online or in headlines, it followed me everywhere like a shadow I couldn't outrun. Every grocery trip felt like walking into a courtroom of strangers silently judging me. Every notification on my phone felt like another piece of my identity being stripped away, and through all of it Olivia stayed far away from me while publicly presenting herself as the woman who had finally escaped years of manipulation, giving interviews through her lawyer where she described how she had trusted the wrong man, and how long it had taken her to find the courage to speak up. And hearing those words replayed on television screens felt like someone rewriting my entire life in a language I didn't recognize, because the person she described was cruel, controlling, and calculating, while the man I remembered being was someone who had sacrificed everything just to prove his loyalty to her. When the trial finally began, the courtroom felt colder than any place I had ever been, not because of the temperature, but because of the eyes watching me. As if the verdict had already been decided long before the judge even sat down. Reporters filling the benches behind the lawyers, cameras waiting outside the courthouse doors. And every time my name was spoken inside that room, it sounded like an accusation rather than a simple identification. And the worst moment came when Olivia took the witness stand and calmly began describing our marriage in a way that made me question my own memories, telling the judge how she had endured years of financial control and emotional pressure, explaining how I had insisted she transfer business authority to my name while secretly moving money through accounts she barely understood. And every sentence she spoke was so carefully constructed, so confident, that even sitting there listening to it, I could almost feel doubt creeping into my own mind, wondering if maybe somewhere along the way I had unknowingly become the man she was describing. Because when someone tells a lie with enough detail and conviction, it starts to feel like truth, especially when all the documents placed in front of the court carried my signature. The trial stretched across several exhausting weeks where prosecutors presented financial records, investigators described the alleged scheme, and my own lawyer struggled to untangle a narrative that had been carefully built long before I even realized I was part of it. And by the time the final hearing approached, I felt completely hollow, like whatever fight had once existed inside me had slowly drained away, because the public had already decided who I was, and I could see the same quiet certainty reflected in the faces of people walking past the courthouse every morning. But the day of the final hearing, something happened that I never expected, something that shook me harder than any accusation or headline ever could. Because as I stepped out of the car and began walking toward the courthouse entrance surrounded by reporters shouting questions I had learned not to answer, I suddenly heard a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice that belonged to a part of my life I thought I had permanently destroyed. And when I turned around, I saw my parents standing near the courthouse steps, older than I remembered, their faces carrying the exhaustion of years I hadn't been there to witness, but still unmistakably the same two people who had once built their entire lives around raising me. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe because shame flooded through me so violently that I wanted to disappear right there on those steps. Because the last time I had seen them, I had slammed a door in their faces and told them to stay out of my life. And yet there they were standing quietly in the middle of the chaos, watching their son walk toward a courtroom where the world believed he was a criminal. And I couldn't even bring myself to look directly at them because I felt like I didn't deserve to see their faces after everything I had done. The reporters noticed them too and immediately began shouting questions, asking if they believed the accusations against me, asking what kind of parents raise a man accused of fraud. And that was the moment my mother did something that broke me in a way I can barely explain even now, because she stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she looked at the crowd of cameras and microphones, and in a voice so soft it almost disappeared beneath the noise, she said only 4 words. "I gave birth to him." And those words cut deeper than any punishment the court could have given me, because in that moment she wasn't defending a reputation or arguing about evidence, she was simply reminding the world that I was still her son, that despite everything that had happened she refused to abandon me the way I had abandoned her. I remember standing there frozen while something inside my chest collapsed under the weight of those words, because I realized that the two people I had pushed out of my life years earlier were now the only ones standing beside me when everyone else had already decided I was guilty. And as we finally entered the courthouse together, my father quietly handed my lawyer a thick folder filled with documents he had been collecting for months, telling him he had started investigating the case on his own after watching the news reports and noticing details that didn't make sense. And inside that folder were emails, transaction records, and financial trails linking Olivia to a series of offshore accounts she had never mentioned to investigators, transfers that had been carefully routed through my name while the money ultimately moved somewhere else entirely, evidence that showed the alleged fraud had been orchestrated long before the investigation began. And as my lawyer began presenting those documents inside the courtroom, the atmosphere slowly shifted in a way I had never experienced before, because the same prosecutors who had spoken with absolute confidence earlier now started whispering urgently among themselves while the judge studied the records more closely, and piece by piece the narrative that had once painted me as the mastermind behind everything began to unravel, revealing a pattern that pointed somewhere else entirely. And while lawyers argued over the details and reporters scribbled notes, I sat there unable to stop the tears sliding down my face, because the people responsible for exposing the truth weren't friends or colleagues or anyone who owed me loyalty. They were the same parents I had rejected years earlier, the same two people I had silenced just to prove my devotion to the woman who had destroyed me, and as the realization settled deeper into my chest, I understood something painful and undeniable. The life I had been fighting to save inside that courtroom was only being rescued because the people I had abandoned had refused to abandon me in return. The court eventually dismissed the charges after the evidence revealed that Olivia had fabricated the entire financial narrative to shield herself from the fraud investigation closing in around her. But the strange thing about justice is that even when it arrives, it rarely repairs what was destroyed along the way, because by the time the judge announced that the accusations against me could no longer stand, my life had already been torn apart piece by piece in ways that no legal ruling could ever undo. The news stations that once displayed my face beside words like fraud, manipulation, and criminal scheme quietly corrected their stories weeks later in small updates buried beneath newer headlines no one bothered reading. The same reporters who once chased me down courthouse steps for dramatic quotes suddenly lost interest the moment the story stopped being scandalous. And while the legal documents now said I was innocent, the world outside that courtroom still remembered the version of me that had been paraded across television screens months earlier. My former employer never called to apologize for terminating me before the trial had even begun. The friends who once filled my weekends with laughter disappeared so completely it felt as if they had never existed in the first place. And every job application I submitted afterward carried the invisible shadow of those accusations because the internet never forgets a scandal even when it was built on lies. Meanwhile, Olivia vanished from my life as quickly as she had entered it, leaving the state after the investigation shifted toward her finances. Her own legal battle beginning in another courtroom far away where I would never again see her face. And for a long time I thought that disappearance would bring me relief, that knowing she was finally facing the consequences of what she had done would somehow make the pain easier to carry. But the truth was far more uncomfortable because the person who had truly destroyed my life wasn't just her. It was also the man I had become while trying to prove my loyalty to her, the man who had slowly pushed away the only people who loved him unconditionally. After the trial ended and the reporters moved on to the next scandal, I found myself standing alone in the parking lot outside the courthouse with nowhere to go, because the house I once owned had already been sold to cover legal costs, and the life I had built around Olivia no longer existed, and that was when my parents quietly walked toward me again, my father placing a hand on my shoulder in the same steady way he had done when I was a child who scraped his knee or failed an exam. And without any speeches or dramatic words they simply told me to come home, the same home I had once told them to stay away from years earlier. Moving back into that house at 36 years old felt like stepping into a mirror that forced me to face every mistake I had made, because the walls still held the memories of who I used to be before pride and blind loyalty turned me into someone unrecognizable, and every quiet dinner at that kitchen table carried a strange mixture of forgiveness and pain. Because my parents never once reminded me of the night I had slammed the door in their faces, never once demanded an apology or asked why I had believed someone else over them. They simply welcomed me back with the same quiet patience they had always shown me, and somehow that kindness hurt more than anger ever could have, because it forced me to confront the truth I had spent years avoiding, that I had abandoned them long before Olivia betrayed me. Rebuilding my life after that became a slow process measured not in big victories but in small moments of humility, taking temporary jobs while trying to restore my professional reputation, learning how to live again without the constant pressure of proving myself to someone else, and most importantly learning how to listen to the people I once ignored, because my parents never lectured me about trust or loyalty. They simply showed me what those things actually looked like by standing beside me when the rest of the world had already walked away. Even now, years later, when I tell this story my voice still shakes at one particular memory that refuses to fade. The image of my mother standing outside that courthouse surrounded by cameras and strangers who had already decided who I was, and the way she looked at them with tears in her eyes before quietly saying the words that broke something inside me forever, I gave birth to him. Because in those 4 words she defended a son who had silenced her, protected a man who had once chosen someone else over his own family, and reminded the world that love doesn't disappear simply because someone makes terrible choices. Sometimes I sit at that same kitchen table late at night after my parents have gone to bed, and I think about how easily my story could have ended differently, how close I came to losing the only 2 people who never stopped believing in me, even when I gave them every reason to walk away. And the truth I've finally accepted is painfully simple. If my mother hadn't spoken those 4 words that day outside the courthouse, if my parents hadn't quietly investigated the truth while I sat alone believing my life was over, I might have lost the only family that ever truly loved me, and I would have deserved it. Moral: I trusted the wrong voice, and silenced the ones who loved me the most. I learned the truth only after my life had already collapsed. If someone asks you to abandon the people who raised you, question why. Because sometimes the people you push away are the only ones who will still stand beside you when everything else burns. If this story moved you, please like, share, and comment to let us know how it made you feel. And if you want to hear more heartbreaking true-style confessions like this, subscribe to the channel, Betrayed by Blood. Your story might be the next one the world needs to hear.